for years, and we always used to read your column in the paper. Actually, important creatures made that column. One being a pug we had. It was the neighborhood pug. Somehow that got in the paper, and I don't know what it did, but somehow it made the column one week. Another time was, about this time of year, the boys' basketball tournament. And who's in the tournament? It's Anigo. And so George, you always did like a little, like, your tournament picks. And he said, George uses a very technical way of doing this. He says, oh, Anigo, I know our neighbors from Anigo, and you know what, there's a Fronic on the Anigo basketball team. Well, I guess I just got to pick them, you know. And it didn't work out, they lost the first game, but you know, anyway. So just some good back and forth between neighbors and stuff, so. Anyway, he's going to be providing a presentation this evening called Deadlines, Slices of Life from the Obit Beat. And he's going to be having it based on his book. So I think without further ado, you don't want to listen to me any longer. George has much more interesting stories than I do. So let's please welcome George Hesselberg.
I don't know whether I'll need this microphone or not. I don't want to yell at everybody. So I do not have a third hand, and Diane does not want to hold the microphone.
I can.
No, I'm just kidding. How's that?
Very good.
Good.
Yes.
Can you hear?
Yes. Just like old pal Mike.
Yeah. Mine. I won't tell jokes, but from when I have an answer to your first question. Sit down, leave me. They'll come back. To answer your first question, I am standing up. I've been speaking at, I like the fact that this is history, because history, I love the topic, and I love the fact that it's still important, and that people think it's important. Yesterday I was in Alaska, at the library there, giving a talk, and I said, you know, I love libraries, and I've got some of the strangest things that happened to me in libraries. When my boys were now ages 40, if you imagine that, right, 40 and 37, when they were little, 4 or 5, we went into Oregon, village of Oregon, to the library there, and Espen, my older one, he was at the time 5. And I said, well, let's look at the books according to the alphabet. And he said, well, that's great, Pops, look, here's one with a V. And I said, yeah, a V. He said, I know a word that starts with V. And I said, what's that? And he said, Valium. And I said, holy mackerel, Espen, where did you get the word Valium? He said, Papa, it's on TV. You turn it up, you turn it down. And my other good library story, this is real history. In now these days when they ask me your age, I always say last century. Back in 1974, I was living in Oslo, working 3 jobs, going to school, and I had no money. So the great thing about Oslo, it has a great big library called Dykeman Library. And I would go in there to wander around and look at books. And one day I was there, and I went down to the immigrant section in the basement, and a pure happenstance found this small pamphlet, that wide, and it said, the title was, Spedalsketten i Amerika. And that means leprosy in America. And I said, I've never seen such a book. And I pulled it out, and what it was the account of two Norwegian doctors who came to America, to the Midwest, to Wisconsin, to track down Norwegian lepers who had immigrated to Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. And not only that, and this is 1870s, they gave the names and they gave where they were. Norwegian lepers in Wisconsin. I said, I've never heard of such a thing. And so of course I couldn't take the book out, but I read it, and that started me on a 74, 84, 94, to a 40-year gathering of string on that topic of leprosy in Wisconsin. And it led to, in 94, me doing a research project on that topic, just by nosing around in the library and being interested in history. And it also contributed to the strangest date I ever had with my former wife, who at the time was my girlfriend. Our second date was, I said, Elsa, did you know that the world's only leprosy museum is in Bergen, Norway? We should go see it. Anyway, and that's history too. Well, can you hear this? Is this good?
Yeah.
Right. It's nice to see some of my good old friends and some new ones also in the group today. Dave, of course, we've bumped heads many times. Chris, more than 30 years, by the way. Ann Sales and I used to trip each other in the hallways of the courthouse. So anyway, when I need it, we'll push it up, okay? There are 3 deaths. The first is when the body ceases to function. The second is when the body is consigned to the grave. The third is that moment sometime in the future, when your name is spoken for the last time. That's what's in this book. I'm trying to stop. I'm trying to keep these people remembered. The fact that their names will be spoken and remembered. And they aren't captains of industry. They aren't famous actors or actresses. Or politicians. In fact, there's kind of an anti-politician bent to this. They're, well, let me go this way. In the middle of my 45 years as a daily newspaper reporter, I returned one night home to a question from my young son. Pops, did you write about anybody living today? The chances were good that my answer was no, and that was the good news. Death was often on the list of my stories for the day. The accidents, the murders, and similar events that ended in a sudden loss of life were just part of what became a career-long interest for me in writing obits, news obits. While I handled my share of deaths of the rich, the famous and the notorious, I was drawn to the curious, the unknown, and the unsung. And those are the ones that make up this book. Those are the deaths that normally don't make a splash, if any mention at all, in the news columns of a daily newspaper. I stretched that to include animals, just because I like animals. And when they die, they have an effect on me too. In this, I always try to get ahead of myself because I want to tell you these stories. In this book are short stories, biographies about the lives of 50 people, 9 animals, 1 tarantula, 1 short order cook, a shiner of shoes, a shoe repairman, the guy who the guy who repaired Jackie Kennedy's shoe when her heel broke off here. A healer, 3 POWs, a sword designer, a secret planter of walnuts, one of my favorite people, a retired ham boner, a distributor of free squash, a successful unknown poet. That's what he wanted to be, an unknown poet, and he was successful. To me, it's just one of the great lines in literature. And I wrote it. So, a successful unknown poet, a circus heiress, Sally Wrigley, a nun, a cat named Rover, a man who stood on his hands in inappropriate places, an unkempt lawyer, also one of my favorite people, Stanley Kaufman, a telephone operator, a night watchman, a female detective, an outlier artist, a radio villain who died every day on the radio in Chicago. And they once found $24,000 in his shoebox under his bed at his place off Berkeley. I don't know. A radio villain, the breeder of pigs with high cholesterol, a guy who when he was a kid, he survived in the forest in Czechoslovakia during World War II, and whose teacher told me he never amounted to anything. This guy would smuggle pig hearts from South America to Madison to do research, and he's the guy who, partly because of him, we know what your cholesterol is, because those pig hearts led him to the research on cholesterol. Great guy. Anyway, a lenient police officer, better known for being a good tickler, a math for dummies teacher, and something you probably already know, a skeleton in a chimney. That, what I just read to you, was part of the pitch for that book I wrote. I wrote the pitch. These days you gotta write a pitch for a book, you gotta sell it to them first before they say, yeah, we'll do this. Let me tell you how this came about. I got my first daily newspaper job at the State Journal in '72. I was hired as a college intern when the State Journal hired a dozen of us, just as interns for the summer, to take obits on the phone from funeral homes. In those days, there were no paid obits. We sat there all day and took obits on the phone, learned to be nice. One thing we all did to start was to take obits over the phone. We typed these obits on Remington typewriters with carbon paper. Here's the deal. If the funeral director included something in that obit that was interesting, we'd bring this to attention to Fred Kernow, the Night City editor. A nice old man, relatively. In Norwegian, we'd call him Spinkle. In other words, he was a little guy, but tough and wiry. And he always had a Newport going in one ashtray and a paper cup full of beer in the other. Anyway, so we'd bring it to his attention. He'd say, why don't you give me a couple of graphs on this? We would pray. We'd be sitting there, we'd be praying at our typewriter for a chance to write those 3 paragraphs that were a real story. An obit, a regular obit in the paper in those days, had to have certain things. We were not allowed to go away from that model. In other words, they followed a particular order and style. Funerals, for example, you find this in the old newspapers. A funeral is held in some place. The visitation is held at some place. We couldn't deviate from that. Spelling was sacred. After you type that thing, you got a big thick pencil and you put a square around that name. It means you double check that name. Believe me, you do not get a second chance to write an obit. And there's nobody more pissed off than a relative who finds their brother's name misspelled in the paper the next day. You do not want to be part of it. So an intern moved from taking obits to getting assignments to covering stories only if you didn't screw up the numbers. Then he began a rookie began a rotation of shifts that still included obits, but you got to go to meetings. Wow. Got to do more news briefs, and if you're really lucky, you got to move to the cop shop. Really lucky. That was the avenue to learning how to write and learning how to report. Those Obit skills took me down the path to some of my most interesting stories, and all the stories included in this book, and all of the interesting people I've ever met in my life. The most wonderful people. As a GA reporter, as a crime reporter, as a columnist, as a legislative reporter, as an investigative reporter, as a feature reporter. I wrote about murders, mysterious deaths, and the deaths that made the front pages. It could have been a fatal fire, a traffic accident, a tornado, a flood. Other times it was the person who died making this story newsreel. Somebody rich or famous report. While working the police and fire beat, starting that, working cops, I started asking more questions about the lives of the people whose deaths would show up in the reports. The reports were simply labeled death investigation. That's all. I would read the reports closely. We were allowed to do that then. We'd go back in patrol, we'd ask for the box, we'd look at the reports. If they trusted you, you got to do that. And then you'd read the reports. And there was, in those days also, there was competition for stories. This may shock you, but there was more than 2 or 3 reporters working in those days. We had reporters, there were reporters everywhere. I'll bet there were 6 or 7 police reporters at the time. At the State Journal, there was 3 alone, Cap Times, all the radio stations, TV stations, and they covered cops, and they were there to check the reports. But none of I was the only one who went back there to actually read the reports, and I was a real pest about it. I could be a real pain in the ass about it because I worked nights and weekends, and you had to be able to get back there when the whole building's closed up. And I can remember on weekends banging on the doors to try to get the police department to say, I got to look at those reports. One Saturday, I was banging on the doors back in the city code, and Henry Gempler, the nicest guy in the world, Lieutenant Hank Gempler and later Captain, he came really to this back door. He had to go around the counter, out the back, past the cafeteria, past the coroner's office to the door I was at outside. He said, Hesselberg, you are one pain in the ass. I said, I gotta get in there. He said, don't tell anybody. He took out his ring of keys. And he gave me a key of the police. So on weekends and nights when I wanted to get in there, there's nobody else to see it and nobody else knew it. Only Henry and I knew it. I would use the key to get in, and then I'd knock quietly on the actual door. And if it wasn't Henry, then they would say, George, how'd you get in here? I said, oh, somebody let me in. But it was our secret forever and ever. Anyway, I would get back there and look one by one through those reports, looking for the little mystery that might lead to an interesting story. Following this mantra became less a strategy and more of a habit. It helped me others uncover stories that might not seem newsworthy, but I thought were worth telling. People in this book, these stories, are the people who populate the periphery of our own lives. And not all of, this is the difference between an obit, paid obit, and a news obit. Not all of these stories have happy endings. In fact, very few of them have happy endings. The temptation is great to tie everything up in a nice bow. That's not the goal of the news obit, and that's not what real life is like. Here are the quiet lives of inspiration, worthy of mention because of circumstances or because a detail may have jumped out and called for attention, which led to more details. Here are lives we may have always wondered about, mysteries sometimes solved, silences explained. And the best example of that is, I've seen this many times over the years. The veteran who dies who never talked about his veteran service. That's the silence that's never explained. It's there somewhere. And in this book there are some like that. There are unbelievable stories. Anyway, mixed in are other tales of immense sadness. There's one story in this book that I cannot read without crying myself and shutting the book. I cannot do it. It's about the death of the son of my friend Ray Maida and his wife Diane. I cannot read it, the last paragraph, without crying. I just can't. Immense sadness. There are lots of joyful memories. All are connected in some way with the topic of death. Missed pets, a beloved tarantula, a miracle survivor. There's a survival story in here that'll just blow your socks. A couple driving down the interstate by Black River Falls from Minnesota. Their car slams into the back of a semi, takes the top off the car, kills the couple. State troopers show up, including one trooper, a pregnant woman. They're clearing up the scene. Everything's everywhere, and they're at the end, and the trooper, the pregnant woman, is walking in the ditch and finds a toy. And she says to her other troopers, was there a third person? Was there a child in this car? I said, no. She goes back to the ditch. What does she find? The child, a little girl, great, in perfect health. That's a miracle. I mean, it is a miracle. There are a few stories about people and animals who were only thought to be dead. I've got a favorite. I'll read the opening to you. A cat who came back. A Vietnam vet who tried to hide. A man who tried to convince the government that he was not dead. Like the others in this book, each of their stories provided a chance to reflect on a life. It also met my most important criteria for inclusion in this book. That was to be a good read. You will not be bored by any story in this book. Open it to any page, but don't read the whole book. Your library has it. You will not be bored. These stories were written between 1977 and 2017, which means you also get to see my evolution as a writer, which is very interesting. To me, it was very interesting. It was really very interesting. It's funny how it was just fun to see how I also evolved as a better writer, as a simpler writer, as a nicer person. I think the longer I worked in seeing all these things and covering cops every day, covering the list, all that stuff, I started out a young cynic. I'm just the least cynical person you could possibly see today. I have great faith. They say that hope and faith is recognizable if you see people standing in line, because that means they're expecting something. They know something will be there. They have a hope. They hope something will happen, and that's also a positive thing too. And I'm a much less of an asshole now than I was 45 years ago. We would not believe. Anyway, I accidentally started this book when I went to the archives to read a story after I had a chat with somebody saying, there are no more characters in F. And I said, no, let me think. Because I spent a lot of time just watching people walking up and down State Street, paying attention to people working there. The key to a story, the key to a good story is find something that doesn't fit. It's not supposed to be there. One day, back in the olden days, I was walking by the science hall on campus, and there were all these work people on ladders pulling the vines off that building. I said, this science hall is supposed to have vines on it. It's a great old building. And so I asked the guys, and they said, we've been told to take all the vines off because the vines are destroying the border on all the campus buildings. In other words, it didn't make sense to me that a great old decrepit building, which is known for being ivy covered, they're removing all the ivy because in Wisconsin in the winter, the water and everything freezes, those vines crawl into those cracks, they expand and contract, and ruin the border on those buildings. And I wrote what I thought was just a very interesting story, in that we don't have any vines in the buildings here because they're being wrecked by that. It's just very interesting. So anyway, that's the way to find it. Something doesn't make sense, it's a good story. And the university hates me because I keep asking questions. And anyway, so I went back, I looked at it, I said, I know a character I wrote about. His name was Cornelius Cook. And he's the first guy. Cornelius. I'll tell you why I wrote about it. Cornelius used to live in a Winnebago by the Miles Park Zoo. It was just falling apart. It was held together literally by duct tape and chicken wire. And in the summer, he would park here, right next to the zoo. In winter, he'd park at a Walmart in Florida. And he'd spend his day walking around. He had a bucket hat and same old khakis and his hands in his pocket, just walk around. Just walk around. And I'd see him all the time because the paper's office is there and I'd be walking down there. Finally, I had to stop him because I said, what's your story? And he's just a retired old guy. Old Navy guy, and grew up in Madison. His father was a barnstorming pilot back in the 30s. That's just what he did. And also, his mom was in the back of the Winnebago. Never comes out, but that's what she was. And so we talked, and I wrote a little feature story to explain to people what this guy was like. And we kind of kept in touch, but of course, everybody who lived and worked around that area knew who he was. So St. Mary's people knew who he was because that's that area. So the people who lived on Vilas and Orchard and all that stuff, they were familiar. Then one day he died, but nobody knew that. He had been in Texas. I remember getting a call from the hospital there saying, "You look at him." And then I got a call from a nurse at St. Mary's saying, Cornelius died. And of course, St. Mary's, all the nurses knew him because he was familiar. And I said, well, that's too bad. And nobody, no relatives. And I said, well, actually, I'll write something about it. She said, so we had a nice chat with her and a couple of the nurses and a guy who lived there. And the nurse said, well, you know what he was doing while he was walking around Madison all those years? With his hands in his pockets. I said, what was he doing? And she said, his pockets were full of walnuts. He would walk all over the place, drop a walnut, press it into the ground, and just keep walking. He did that for years and years and years. That's what he was doing. And that's Madison history, or maybe in 40 years or something like that. Anyway, writing about Cornelius, going back to read the Cornelius story, I thought, you know, these are real people, what a consultant would call an RP. But those are as important to the history of any place as anybody else, aren't they? So anyway, I looked up other people. I thought people would be interested in reading about this. Angel Richardson. I mean, the money you pay for this book is covered just in the story about Angel Richardson. Right? And I knew her for years because I followed her up and down State Street. She's not a, you'd call a pleasant, cuddly person. But, on the other hand, she's, let me I'm going to show a picture before this. Oh, yeah. There we go. That's Cornelius. But Angel, let's see if I can Angel. There's Angel. I'll go off the script here and talk about Angel. One of my favorite stories about Angel, homeless lady, but grew up in wealth, lived in France, spoke fluent French. The rumors are that she and her family exchanged letters with the French resistance. She once was in line to inherit an entire city block of the city of Chicago. But in the 40s, she gave birth to twins, 2 boys. And those are not the days when people knew about or cared about hormones and the effect a birth could have on a woman. And they thought she was nuts. They put her away. And they sent her sons and the father. The father took the sons off and told her, your sons are dead. And she got out, she had small typing jobs and stuff, but eventually she landed on the streets of Madison. In fact, it's in the book, her long name, her full name is Angel Babcock Fuller, I think, of Richardson. Now and she was relatives of the Fullers and Fullerwoods, of the Babcocks and Babcocks. But she was pretty much alone. She thought she was alone. Secretly, she had people watching out for her. W. Cobb. a social worker who like tagged her, basically, watched her. And once a month, my favorite story in the whole book, Angel, living on the streets, reading French novels at the Memorial Library when she could, chain-smoking Newports, once a month would walk in the Madison police station, walk behind the counter, walk over to Denny Reno's desk, pull out the drawer and take a $20 bill, put it in her pocket, then she'd go away. Later in the month, after she got her check, she'd go to the police department, walk behind the counter, go to Denny Reno's, Sergeant Reno's desk, pull up the drawer, and put the $20 bill back. And the story, it's the longest story in here. I spent weeks researching it before computers. And this is after she died. We found her granddaughter in Seattle, who had actually a box with a chest. Her sons grew up out there. I don't know whether she actually knew that, or she still had, if anybody found her sons. I don't think so. But the granddaughter knew about her. And I contacted her through a genealogy guy. But anyway, Angel Richardson, that was Angel. So she had a dark wig, a thick shawl, dragging bags along. So here's the ultimate description. The pandemic. Here's why this book. Here's how I wrote this book. I got pissed off about this. The pandemic caused the delay or cancellation of many funerals and get-togethers of friends and family. These events are where the stories are told. The acts of kindness and folly are recalled. The memories of sacrifice and serendipity are brought out one last time. Grudges, lifetime family grudges, are revealed and buried again. Missed opportunities are recounted. Romances are relived. Oh, what could have happened? Trophy bucks are chased again. In fact, I remember when my dad died. I'm going off script again. When my dad died, it was right at the start of the pandemic, so we didn't get to do this. But I really wanted somebody to tell the story about the deer hunters he was with. There was one hunter in his gang who always shot the smallest deer, just like baby deer. And one day at the bar after hunting, somebody snuck out and attached a mouse trap to the foot of that deer. Anyway, bucks are chased away again. In their temporary absence, the importance of taking the time to pause and reflect became even more apparent. We must not hurry past these lives without noting the things that set us apart from one another, or pausing to appreciate what we all have in common. What we all have in common is that we are different. An important part of the human experience is sharing it. I hope that these stories remind others to do just that. And that was my point. And that's why these are what we would call evergreen stories. We could read any one of them, and that person could have died yesterday. They're not tied to an event. So now let's go through a couple of people, if you don't mind. Unless you have a question right away. But just, Angel we talked about. And that's exactly what she looked like. And she had this wig on, this red auburn wig that she wore every day for 100 years. So there's Cornelius. There's Skipper. Skipper was the first mascot dog of the Humane Society. And he spends his life as a female impersonator. Because they passed him off as a female dog in all their commercials. And when he died, it was like a big deal for the people who knew the Humane Society. He was a good dog. He was a good dog. Anyway, what is it? And there he is, Mark Maida. Great guy. That's Recognize that guy? History, Cecil Sanders?
Yes.
He's
Looks a
over
little
here.
different.
Well, it's funny about Cecil, that's included in here, is that, you know, everybody says that that Cecil made their sandals, but not, he didn't do that. He didn't. There's like, people who worked for him who made those sandals, people who mistook their sandals for being made by Cecil, but it's true, his sandals last forever. And his children, his son, I think, is still doing that. Anyway, Cecil's in here, a good guy. There's a fight over how he made his first sandal. It's like, great, that is. Kenny Stout, he's got a clean nose here, and that means that this is after his mother died, because he had a wart about that long at the end of his nose. Kenny Stout, Kenny Stout, I can tell, I'll read the first graph of Kenny Stout, and you see if you want to read the rest of it. Kenny died in, he died in May 1993. I met Kenny Stout and most of his 22 cats the day his mother died in December 1981, after she froze her legs while watching Johnny Carson in their unheated home in Verona. Wouldn't you want to read that story? He was 57 at the time. He had noticed that his mother's legs were frozen. They had one electric cord plugged into the TV to watch Johnny Carson. He had noticed that his mother's legs were frozen and moved her from a cot to a chair to be closer to the coal stove, a tiny open grate stove, the only heat in the house. This is a house in the middle of Verona, not out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by other homes. He called the ambulance on Tuesday night. She died in the hospital Wednesday morning. I go Thursday. I was out there right away the next morning with L. Roger Turner, a really good photographer. Kenny was there with the cats, 23 cats. And Roger took the photo of his life of Kenny in front of that grated stove with the cats hanging on the walls all around him. He and his mother had lived in a one-story house filled with 80 years worth of junk and garbage, 24 cats, a single outlet into which he plugged a hot plate and a television set. The stove was so full of holes you could see the coals when the door was closed. So what happened was, Kenny was known in Verona because he rode his bike around, had a big windshield on it, he had a long wart on his nose, everybody knew him. He's not all there, obviously. He lived with his mom. And after she died, and I wrote a story, and I also broke a journalism law by saying, well, the hell with this, I'm going over to Bill's and getting some food for him and the cats. So I did that, came back, then we sat and chatted. Then I got a hold of Dave on these social people, angels of all. And one of the workers there said, well, let me look at this. And she found, bless her soul, that Kenny's mother still had part of her teacher's pension. So we arranged for Kenny to get that pension, get cleaned up. He had the pension, he said, well, I want to go back to Hawaii where I was in the Navy. He's growing up, he could do whatever he wants. So he got on a bus, and the bus, of course, had a big accident in Montana on the way to California. Nothing had worked for that guy. Got to California, got a plane to Hawaii, got a job as a groundskeeper, and lived there for the rest of his life, happy as a clam. And I got word when he died, and I said, I'll write his obit. Damn it, I wrote his obit. It's in here. That was Kenny stuff.
What happened to the cats?
The cats were all taken care of by the minister. Yeah, oh yeah. That's Kenny. Huh. This is Odvar Carlson. Odvar Carlson, I first met him when I fell asleep at his dinner table, sitting next to his daughter, who had said to me, George, you gotta come meet my parents. It was in southern Norway, in Eidanger. She said, I'll warn you that my dad reads Time magazine. So I read the Time magazine. I worked that night before as a night watchman for the Norwegian Telephone Company, and that morning at an Italian restaurant. And I was dead tired. We caught the train to Eidanger. I I got the eye downer, sat down at dinner with Obit, and asked him a question about Time Magazine. Yes. And then while he was answering it, I fell asleep. Obit is a stone cutter. His hands were this big. His father was a stone cutter. His grandfather was a stone cutter. All of his brothers were stone cutters. And he came to visit, he and Gerd, his lovely wife, Gerd, would tell me hilarious stories about rations during the war in Norway, when you could hear the new bread because they made the bread out of nutshells, and if you swallowed it, your stomach started growling. So the women would meet each other in the street, and they'd say, "Have you heard the new bread yet?" Anyway, he came to Madison as a stone cutter, and he went up to took him up to the Capitol, and the Capitol has in the middle these huge black pillars. Huge. Those pillars come from Norway, where he was born. It's called a larvica. And they have little sparkles in them. They're famous. The world over. Because you can buy a very expensive gravestone. He saw those pillars and he went like this with his big hands and said, Penstein, which is a beautiful stone. Beautiful stone. He was a great guy and wonderful father-in-law. And when Elsa and I divorced, well, short story, we're still together, but we've been divorced for 22 years. Go figure that out. Anyway, he was a great guy. He taught my boys. My boys would go there in the summer with Elsa, and he taught them everything. He taught them how to take a piece of a tree and make a whistle and put the bark back on. You name it. Obit Carlson. Now this, I'll read you the first graph of this story. That's a cat named Charlie. And that's my knuckleheaded son, Ivan, who, when I told him I would use this photo in the book, he said, "Did you ask my permission?" Here's the first paragraph of this story. I was writing columns at the time. Part of my job, writing a column is hard. You can't worry about what people think. I mean, part of your job is to piss people off. So I was really good at that. But I also got to write columns like this. Charlie, who died in 1996. Actually, 1995. It was getting 1996 because, well, it was so warm a week ago Sunday, I almost buried Charlie, our frozen pet cat. Well, he died in the winter. So we wrapped him up and put him in the freezer, waited for the spring thaw to bury him. So there's a whole story here about how the moles celebrated his death. Charlie. Here's the fire plug right here. Mary Ostrander, groundbreaking detective in the National Police Department. She's the one who filed a lawsuit back in the day saying, "I'm a cop. You should pay me like you pay the other cops." She's in here. She was good people. Simon Sparrow, Madison's outlier artist. That's one of his pieces in the back there. A lot of people don't know that he was a street preacher down on State Street. I think I mentioned Chief Polar Bear at the Madison College Park Zoo. He was shot in, Chris, when was it? Literally. That's an interesting story because it was a Sunday morning, I remember that. And that was 1988. March 15th, 88. Chief was in his pen doing what bears do, and somebody jumped in his pen on a Sunday morning, and the poor guy, got sent, had to shoot the polar bear to save the crazy guy. And of course the cop got all kinds of fancy things said about him. But after that I said, well, somebody should write Chief's Obit. I mean, he was 72 to 88, 16 years old. So I looked him up. I tracked him back to his cub life in Canada, what about his whole life, what he ate, He had no friends because he was a mean bear. And everybody knew that because he was being a bear. That's what bears do. Anyway, Chief was a that was a good Obit. That's my friend, not my friend, but I didn't know him. Which I was walking by Jan with one of his pigs. He developed these pigs that you could test for cholesterol. And one night, and all his pigs were out of Arlington at the farm, farm of Arlington. One night they had a huge fire out there. And they were worried that he had lost all of his pigs. They did, they had 4 left. I remember working that night, covering cops and fire, and we had such a blast with this story. This is a typical newsroom story, because we called it the Day of Swine and Hoses. Terrible. Speaking of pigs, this is the unknown Hamlet, who was the competitor to Jimmy the Groundhog. He was what the Cottage Grove people called out on February 2nd and had his own banquet to compete with Jimmy. And I wrote about him when he died. And I got to use all kinds of terrible Shakespeare quotes. It was just unbelievable. It's a fun. And you will remember this guy. What year was that? 89 maybe? This guy, that's the recreation of what the person looked like whose bones were found at the bottom of the incinerator chimney of Good and Loud Music on University Avenue. All they found was a pile of bones, a dress, some jewelry, some women's shoes, and for the first couple of weeks they thought, well, we have a woman to track down. Turned out it wasn't a woman, it was a guy. And that, because of the circumstances involving that, somebody had to stuff his body down a very narrow chimney, and then it probably slowly deteriorated and fell in that order. The problem is, and what bothered me, is that the only people who really cared about this guy, and this was a man with many things that you can speculate on what he was doing there and how he got there, none of them pleasant. Nobody really gave a damn about him after that, except for a couple cops, a couple investigators. And every September I wrote that story, saying here are the leads, here's what might have happened. He is somebody's brother, uncle, son, grandson. Mass is not that big of a town. Somebody has to have missed him, that person gone missing. And those were pre-DNA search days. And every year I wrote about it, and Jimmy Grant was all over it. Odd duck, but still he was all only guy on it. Still in the cold case file. It came up again 2 years ago because of DNA, they saved DNA from this guy, and they can compare it, but you can only identify it based on what you have to compare it with. So even though they can check databases all over the place, unless there's somebody in those databases who have a match for that, they'll never find out. On the other hand, on the third hand, maybe somebody who knows him doesn't want people to know that he or she knows him. Maybe there's a person out there who did know him, who was happy that he's not identified or that. There's all kinds of possibilities. But anyway, it's currently still out there in the news. You know, the State Journal wrote about it, a young police reporter wrote about it a few weeks ago, in the DNA book, and Doug Moore wrote about it a year and a half ago when they started it. So it's still out there. Who's Casey? Casey the chimpanzee. Let me see here. Casey was part of a group of traveling chimpanzees. See, the thing is, you can't make this stuff up. You really can't. Casey was part of a group of traveling chimpanzees based in Rockford. It was a traveling show set up by a gorilla wrestler. I tell you can't make this stuff up. And you know, they taught the chimpanzees to smoke and stuff like that. Well, the bottom dropped out of the traveling chimpanzee market. And the gorilla wrestler, gave Casey and the rest of the girls to Riley's Park Zoo. And left them there. And they, okay, we'll take care of them. My favorite line of this whole thing. And that was in 95. At the time, still alive, because he didn't die until 2013. At the time, a newspaper article noted that when the chimps, so the guy came to visit, the gorilla wrestler. When the chimps first saw the Klings, after they were donated to the zoo, the chimps were so hurt they wouldn't wave back. In fact, they turned their backs on him instead. Is that hilarious or what? There are lots of stories like this. I think that everybody has a secret story. I have a secret story. We all have secret stories. Some of them take those stories to our grave, but some of us share them, or if somebody says, if they're smart, they'll talk to you before you die and say, do you have any stories? Here's another thing. We wait until people die and we write about them and this and that. However, by the time you die, the people who have had the most influence over you are gone. So you don't know. You don't know who influenced me. You don't know that Mrs. Majeski in high school told me you should be ragged. You don't know that in 1971, the King of Norway, Olaf, I was at his summer palace on Big Boy Island, and he gave me a Cuban cigar. Really? I threw that cigar out about 3 months ago. And my friend Vicki Gallagher, who I'm still in touch with, she still has her cigar. She'll talk about it all the time. Anyway, those are little stories that make you more human. Your obit does not have to be a list of the organizations you belong to. Why put in your obit the things that everybody already knows? Tell them something about you. Who influenced you? My dad, I talked to him before dementia really took him over. Because I said, I'm going to write your obit. He said, okay. And goodness knows, guys, my dad, he died 2 years ago, 95. I said, what did you do? I mean, what did you like to do? He said, well, I liked cars. And he was old, so slow. And I said, tell me about cars. And that son of a gun named for me every single car that he had bought, traded, found between 1943 and 2020. He would come home from Depot, he was a Depot agent up in Westby, drive back to Bangor in an Oldsmobile, stop and cash in for a beer and come home in a Chevy. He knew every single car. It was just hilarious. Before my mom died, and you should all do this. I talked to her, I said, hey, hold it, Mom. And she said, okay, and my mom's just sweet as pie. She worked at Ford for 100 years. Anyway, so I said, well, tell me some of your favorite things. Just talk about this and that. She grew up in the Depression and put herself through. Anyway, and I said, here's one, Mom. My mom is not a drinker, was not a drinker. But she had, she's Wisconsin. And they go out for fish. And I said, Mom, what was your favorite drink? And she said, oh, George, you can't put that in the paper. I said, Mom, come on. She said, okay. She said, she looked at me, she said, fuzzy navy. And I put that in her obit. So, anyway, that's my, if you're not writing about death, you're writing about life. That's what you're doing. We don't care about the last 3 days of your life. I care about the first 65, or the middle 17, or the guy who came home to Portage and didn't tell a soul that he followed his plane to the ground in Italy and spent 2 years on camp and never talked about it. That kind of stuff. Those are stories. That's part of our thread, part of our history, what makes us us. As I say, because we're all different, we're the same. Questions? Anything? Want to talk about anything? Oh, we're talking about the fact that none of this stuff, not one of these stories would ever have been in the newspaper today. They just don't do that. They can't. They don't have the space, they don't have the people, they don't have the time, and it just kills me. And then I read the Obits. Have you noticed that artificial intelligence has taken over Obit writing? You can see it. There's phrases that are repeated. There's the overuse of adjectives that mean absolutely nothing. You can read it in the State Journal this Sunday if you want. Go through and see the phrases that are just repeated and the descriptions that are the same for a bunch of different people. You can tell the ones that people actually had put their own fingerprints on. It's good to have templates. That's good. I mean, funeral directors have had templates for a gazillion years. But that's a template. You alter that. You make it your own. You make it your family's own. I mean, my opinion. It's just you're paying for it. Actually, one of the big, you can put whatever you damn well please in a paid Obit. It doesn't have to be true. Nobody vets it. One of the guys in here, a guy who I was politically 180 degrees away from, Don Heiliger. Don Heiliger, a POW who really went through the war, and then came back amongst his family, who I got along with like peanut butter and jelly. And we talked, he called me because as a POW, he was a member of an informal group that did checks on whether people were telling the truth in their obits, lots of times, about whether they were a POW or not. Because it's one of the most repeated false information in obits, that in Purple Hearts. There's a special group that checks on Purple Hearts too. Not because that person who died lied about it, but most of the time because their family thought that was true. That was that, we'll put it in there. And it's not. So he and his group would check up on it. It's not that hard to do. You can look up POWs if you want. You can look up anything you want. But he's in here too, actually. Very interesting character. Very interesting. He was a quality person, I thought. Anyway, questions?
One question.
Sure, as many as you want.
Is Snowball in there?
Snowball's not in here, although I wrote his obit.
Did you?
Yes, I did, yes. I remember because I might have been at his autopsy because they had to cut, he was wearing like 4 or 5 pairs of pants. And they had to cut through to get him off. It was that he just put another pair on. Yeah. No, I did his obit, but it's not in here. He was a character. And there are several of them. There aren't any anymore. There's a couple down there, but not like it used to be. You don't have the characters wandering around. Yes?
There's one guy that is maybe too fresh or too recent for this book. That's out there playing baseball all the time. You know, I've ever seen him.
Whereabouts?
Down on the square.
Really?
Yeah, he has a ball.
Yeah. I know the kid.
I saw him, but he's
Yeah.
20 years old.
Yeah, and he's a little heavy set?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know the guy, yeah.
Yeah, and the Nazi check.
I have not seen him in a while.
Yeah.
But there were guys that, the actual characters, Scanner Dan, Art the Window Washer, Brian the Spitter, those guys. Brian the Spitter, I recall, he had a deal with Art the Window Washer. Because, obviously, Brian would go along and spit on the window. Art the Window Washer would come by and say, geez, you've got spit in there. But anyway, I love characters, and I probably spend too much time. The police shifts go from 3 to 11 back in the day, still do, I think. And and in those days also, the State Journal offices were right off the square. So you get off work late if you're working 3 to 11 shift or sometimes 62, and it would be easy to walk down State Street with a brand new newspaper. We're just young reporters thinking, what more could attract a beautiful woman than walking down with a fresh newspaper? That never worked at all. But then I kept doing that all, and I still do it. Walk up and down State Street at odd times. And strange things happen on that street. Not as much as they used to. And these days, there's a lot of homeless sleeping in those, even now with this weather, in those first 2 blocks off the square, they roll out their bags, and I talk to those guys. But I've had some strange things happen. One of my favorite stories, you might remember this, Chris, Howard Payne was working on State Street, and he came by, and there was this young woman who had tried to climb over an iron grate with pointed tops. She got halfway up there and slipped and impaled herself to her leg right here on that grate. And Howard Payne, the cop who got there, the only thing he could do was say, "Stay still, I'm going to try to lift you up over this." And he did it. It was amazing. And the only reason we found out about that is because the girl actually, wrote Howard the nicest thank you letter I have ever read. And Howard wouldn't even talk about it at the time, but I found it. And that was on State Street. Man, I was on State Street the night Wisconsin beat Iowa, 1969. That was when Elroy Hirsch was on the top of the broadhouse. And, yeah, I remember that night. I remember it because I went to the game. I was a freshman. Went to the game. I had a date with this woman named Libby, which was a totally stupid date, but I was a freshman, so I didn't know what to do. But we went to the early nights of Broome Street Theater. Right, it used to be right on State Street, second floor. We'd never been to a theater in my life. I was been in Nashville 2 months, trying to impress this girl. And it was a movie called, it was a theater, I can tell you, I couldn't believe I remember it. It was called Panoramic Ceremony. It started out with 6 men walking in with a naked woman on their shoulder. And all the men had balloons tied between their legs. And Libby, my date I just met, was looking at me saying, "Oh, you're that kind of guy." Oh, anyway, I'm sorry. Any more questions? Otherwise, you don't want to sit next to me in a bar. We would just talk to them. Yeah.
Did you know Eddie Van Elsen?
Eddie and I were good friends. I wrote his own, actually, and I just talked with his wife a couple of weeks ago. Eddie, I knew quite well. There's a character. There's another character. You don't see guys like that anymore. Well, Eddie was. I wish I would have included him in here because people don't know who he was these days. And who else is in here? There's another lawyer in there.
Did you buy part of his sale pitch?
No, I knew him long before that when he was like, he ran the No Hassle Boutique. He was a boutique owner and lawyer. He was the Looney lawyer. He ran for DA by stripping on the stage at the Dangle. And he had a sign on his wall that said, "Only obey good law." Yeah.
I have a short story about Eddie that I'd like to share because it's so typical of Eddie. I was an law student, so I got to know him.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, we got involved in a state situation up in the town here, up there. Anyway, the recreation city right there. Got involved with the attorney called and said, "Look, you guys know this Eddie Nelson guy?" And he said, "Oh, sure, wait about Eddie." And he said, "Well, we just filed a probate here. It's a sizable probate, and everything is going to multiple different charities. We're just going to forward it on and talk." And I've had a bunch of nieces and nephews raise the question about the will. But he said, more importantly, I've got an objection to the will be to probate from through this attorney's office in Madison. I thought, I don't know why they filed. Well, as it turns out, Ed said to me, I said, what do you want to call it? He said, well, he said, you know, that place up there, most of the charitable money is going to go to this hospital, which the patients in this hospital are all old retirees and are wealthy from that area. They don't really need the money. But he said, I've got a couple of projects that I'm working on. This is the roulette, you know. And he said, okay, I'd like to have like 5% of each. Some of the modest percentage anyway. And we called the attorney up there and told him what the story was. Of course, he was just elated because he's got his problem all solved right there. And that's what he wanted.
Yeah.
He didn't, you know, as far as the money wasn't paid to anyone else in trust.
No.
It got paid right to her, everyone.
He was like the back porch helper for Rose Kennedy, or the Kennedy daughter. I think it was Rose. The daughter of Jefferson. Remember her name? Any other questions or? Oh yeah,
Rosemary.
Rosemary. That's it. Yeah, Rosemary. Yeah, you know, lawyers. Ken Hur's in here just because I wanted to piss the people off who hated Ken Hur.
One more.
Go ahead.
So who writes yours?
You know, oh, I forgot to tell you that story. Mine's already, when I was a young reporter running all these obits, we'd be sitting around at night. We had 2 or 3 jobs. One of them was to make sure to go over to Shamrock and buy old Milwaukee 6-packs for $1.10 and share them in the newsroom for all the rest of them, those copy editors and stuff. So the youngest had to do that. And the Shamrock, of course, got to meet Patty. You know, Patty was built like a great instrument. She had the best name. And anyway, so we come back with the old Milwaukee, and then it would get boring. I mean, sometimes nothing happens. Strange but true. So we decided to write all our own obits, and every person that works there has in the morgue, all that, a clip file, and we wrote our own obits and put them in our files. My obit says that I'm found on the bottom of Lake Wingram with a typewriter attached to my body. And otherwise, all the information is true. Address, 540 West Mifflin, and parents and survivors and all that kind of stuff. And I even had a quote from the managing editor, Bill Robbins at the time, saying that I think he worked here. So, and that was in the file, and several of us did it, and I replaced that with another one where it was still similar, but I took out that lake thing. Because you never know, somebody might pull it out and use the damn thing. Speaking of 540 West Mifflin, if you know the 500 block of West Mifflin, if you know that I started the state journalism as a student in 1972, and I thought at my first day of work that you had to get dressed up. So me living at 540 West Mifflin, walking those 6 blocks up Mifflin Street, wearing a 3-piece suit to my first day in the State Journal, it happened once. All right, thank you.
Okay, George will have some books for sale and he'll sign over there. Also,
But the library, all the libraries in town have copies of the books.
Also, books for sale over there on the way up, $1 a piece. And short time to our next meeting on April 11th because we're a week later. April 11th, Rob Zaleski will be talking.
Rob gives a good.
Anyway, have a happy Easter, travel safe, stay safe in the snow, and